In many European countries, when we talk about Holocaust, we often hear one main story. But behind of this story, there are many groups of different people who were persecuted by the different reasons. For example, their skin color, identity, their background, their beliefs, art they produced, or just simply who they loved. My name is Petro Rusanienko, and you are listening to the Echoes of Memory podcast. Today our guests are Kat, Florentina, and Estera.
Hello.
Thank you all
Hello.
for being here. Before we start, could each of you briefly introduce yourself?
Okay. Hi,
Hi.
Petro. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here. It's such a pleasure and an honor to dwell into these topics that we are about to unpack. My name is Kat Jugravu. I am of a certain age and experience. I am an intersectional, multidisciplinary trans artist. I work at intersections of theater, political work, activism, and pedagogies. I am the Vorstand of a new association called ICTIA, the Institute for Trans and Queer Autonomy, that activates in the field of creating sustainable structures for queer and trans initiatives in Berlin, hopefully at a European level soon. I'm also the founder of the Queertos Collective, which is let's say a platform for radical performativities for the queer communities. I'm also an educator like Estera. I activate mostly into academia and university level. I'm an actor as well, performer, dancer, and also poet. And all in all, a very, very curious person to learn, to discover, and to experience new situations. Yes.
Thank you, Kat. If that's briefly, I'm scared. What is the full then?
Oh, you have no idea. You have no idea. As I said, I am of a certain age, not that much, but it's still like, and I think we will talk later why that is.
Right.
Hi everyone, thank you for having me. I'm Florentina-Manea. I'm a Roma feminist activist. I'm a researcher, a political scientist, and I'm also a professional troublemaker who is committed to challenging the systems of oppression that are trying to erase us and our experiences as the Roma community, but especially as Romani women.
So my name is Estera. I'm 22 years old. I'm also a Roma activist. I'm doing a lot of politics. I'm working at the Romani Pen archive, and I'm studying to become a primary teacher. I'm also an actress, and I also write a lot, and I'm also very happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. We just come back from the Sinti and Roma Memorial. And I know that, Florentina, you were the first time at the memorial, so I want to ask you just shortly about your reflection. How did you find that?
I think I was conflicted because I was happy to see it and grateful to have this opportunity, but at the same time, it was painful to see the stories of my ancestors and what they've been through. But again, I'm very happy and grateful that I could see their stories of resistance and how they survived these atrocities.
I had no idea that this was actually the first time you were there. That's so special.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we need to run for the shooting. I would give you more space to explore the memorial itself, but maybe you have time later. So I hope that you will join. You will visit that again. At that point, I would like to say that we all know about the Jewish victims. There is a memorial next to the Roma memorial, not that far. And we tried to make visible Roma victims as this memorial in the center of Berlin. But there are also many groups were attacked by the Nazis, which are kind of left in shadow. So I would like to open the discussion about what kind of groups were also targeted by the Nazis. Let's name them. For example, people with disabilities, black people, we not often hear about them, asocials, including homeless people, sex workers. Of course, queer people. There is a monument also next to the Jewish and Roma memorial dedicated to the people, LGBTQ plus people who were murdered, mostly gay men. I know that they were wearing the pink triangle. What kind of groups do you know that I didn't listen?
I think it's of course now here we want to name these groups, but in general it's everyone that didn't fit the agenda of the Nationalsozialismus, and
Exactly.
you named also homeless people, and it's like, funnily enough, you could also look nowadays as to which groups are ostracized, and it's like the categories have not changed that much. Unfortunately, we haven't advanced that much into accepting, helping, integrating, and overcoming discrimination based on like class, religion, sex, sexual identity, gender identity. So I think look at everybody that from a social, like normative society, like draws the society back. Those are the same categories.
Yeah.
To say so. No, like you also say like queer people, but maybe it's important we say no, like lesbian, gay men, transgender people. Also, as we know, like the book burnings started first of all with knowledge of and research on transgender individuals.
Yeah, I completely agree with the reference for the presence, because it also happened. Same with the artist.
The Nazi regime built this entire logic of purity to justify its violence and all the crimes they committed against, as you mentioned, Petro, Roma, Sinti, people with disabilities, queer people, especially gay men who are considered to be deviant and disposable. And I believe that what connects them is the fact that they were considered to be ungovernable. And as you said, Kat, they were unfit for this fascist utopia. And I think that this idea of unfit didn't end with the concentration camps, because we see it today in how the systems are trying to police whose life matter more, who has access to services like healthcare, like housing, like and so on, and also whose knowledge matters more, who gets access to knowledge, also who gets to be left unnamed in our stories.
These are structures that, unfortunately, I must say, at some levels we also uphold now as like workers, and of course it's impossible always to address everybody, and we end up naming categories, but we do have to be careful, and we do have to understand that in the end, working in the system, you might also turn into a supporter of the very same erasure that we are working against.
So moving forward, I also want to pay your attention to the symbols, to the badges that all those groups were given. First of all, I would like to talk about what kind of symbols they had, and to which exactly group it was dedicated. Like, we know all that yellow star was Jewish, brown triangle was Roma. As I already mentioned, for the queer gay people, it was a pink triangle. What else? Don't you remember?
Black for socials.
Exactly. What do you think about these symbols? What they say? The main thought when you are reducing the humanity to the label, to just a symbol.
I believe that these triangles are more than just symbols or just labels. I believe that they are state-sponsored attempts to flatten our identities and to erase our complexities. And I believe that what was used then to bring shame on us, I believe that now it's used to reclaim and to resist So take for instance the black triangles for socials. For me, this is a reminder that women who refuse to conform, like sex workers, Romani women, queer women, existed, resisted, and survived. And I believe that these labels definitely don't define us, even though it's super important to acknowledge this trauma and to heal it. But I think it's even more important how we rise in spite of these labels.
I've read an article when the gay community used the pink triangle as a symbol of resistance and to show that we are still existing.
Well, I mean, I think not all communities are ready to, reclaim these symbols, like as you were saying as well. And I think we mustn't forget this were used as a measure, as a way to quantify, like the people that were being ostracized and murdered ultimately. And I think this comes to every community, whether they're ready to reclaim their symbols of oppression. And the fact that the queer community has managed to do that, and that's, the pink triangle was reclaimed during the AIDS epidemic and the ACT UP movement, and it felt like a very needed symbol, as you said as well. It's like to remember that we are here, we matter, and you owe us in a way. You owe us, like the state owes the people the attention and the care that was required back then in terms of access to the health system, medication, and whatnot.
I just wanted to add that also the symbols was put on us to systematic stigmatize us, because also it was so many people, and I think that also the Nazis were confused of us. So many
how
people.
to identify
yes,
us.
Exactly.
How do I quantify them?
Yeah.
How do I put everybody in that box?
Exactly.
To
Yes, and I think this was their idea to recognize us and just to put us in the symbols and to make a list on us and just to pick us like, okay, you just go in the concentration camps because you have this symbol.
Well, I think it was like, first they would pick you out from the streets
From
or
the
at
street,
home.
yeah, exactly.
You would go through this whole registration process. Let's also not forget the tattoos, and then you would be categorized. And it's funny because like we constantly need to, like, we use the past to learn about the present and to criticize and analyze. It's like we function as society in categories, in boxes, and this is absolutely crazy. Like we've learned what?
Was it the different, how should I say, attention to the different labels and different groups? I mean, we know that in Auschwitz, Nazis kept Roma families in the family camp. It's called family camp. What about other groups? Do you know anything? Do you know any personal stories? Or you heard something? And how you personally think, what was the attention to different labels and different groups?
This has been for me like and it is a question, because I was just wondering, so what about, the intersection of violence, and how did like specific people that were Romani, that were trans or queer or sex workers, like, where would they be sent? Now there are some studies and there are, but not enough, unfortunately. I don't think we have enough like data about specific, lodging, to say. So this is it's definitely a cruel idea of, it's not lodging, but we're talking about the different subcategories, and let's talk about the lesbians, for example, and how lesbians were put under this category of asocial. So that would actually separate them from the gay men.
Yeah.
Right?
That is why mostly pink triangle
The pink
associated
triangle
with the gay man.
would be men, right? We're talking about the infamous Article 175 that came at the end of the 1800s, and under National Socialism, it became like a way to persecute people under this particular article, which referred to gay men. Now, as a trans individual myself, and being assigned male at birth, I can also fabulate on the idea that amongst these men there were also a lot of trans femme individuals, for example.
Let me drive our discussion to the group of women, because the women's role in the anti-Nazis movement are kinda in a shadow as well. But maybe, I know that Florentina, you are studying the gender studies, and it shaped your identity itself, and then you could be persecuted because of that. So do you have any examples, some meaningful people as an example?
Absolutely. So I think that resistance is most of the time centered around men. And I think that women, but especially racialized women, resisted with everything they had, with their bodies, with their language, with their silence, even with their survival. And I have many examples. I think I would like to start with Rosa Luxemburg's defiance and how her rich and radical intellectual legacy contributed to the Marxist theory, and how she developed critical links between concepts such as capitalism, imperialism, and militarism. And
It was important that she was killed before the Second World War,
Yeah.
but she became a symbol still. Yeah, sorry.
I think it's also important to mention Sophie Scholl's White Rose leaflets that were urging people to stop the genocide and to talk about this injustice. But I think it's still very important to talk also about so many unnamed Roma women who risked their own lives by trying to help others. So, and we have, for instance, Alfreda Markowska, who saved so many Jewish and Roma children lives by saving them from death. And we also have women who were carrying, secret messages, or just even small pieces of food for families, or even many more women who raised actually the orphan children of the people who were killed in the concentration camps. And I think that in this context, gender was used also as a dangerous thing, but also as something to sabotage everything, as a weapon.
Yeah.
Because the Nazis actually underestimated women, and they thought of them as being not political and also passive. And this small miscalculation actually gave women the space to operate and to sabotage, and most importantly to organize.
Yes, there is many facts how a woman worked underground as organizers, as a couriers for some important things on the front line.
There's definitely resistance. And in some discussions that I had with Romani women who were telling me that silent resistance is still always resistance, I totally agree with that, because resistance doesn't always have to be spectacular and loud and very visible to be effective and political and to be called resistance. And I think that we should definitely hold the space for this kind of resistance that is not always in the textbooks, but without whom survival wouldn't have been possible.
We have also Zili Schmidt. This is a Sinti woman. She was also the one survivor of her whole family, and she was seeing her child being killed by the Nazis. And she was the one woman who survived in her whole family.
She's been invited to many events where she was invited to talk about her stories.
Yeah.
And tell
Because she couldn't tell the story because it was so hard and it's so brutal that no one wants really to hear. And she was telling in an interview that always when she closed her eyes, she is in Auschwitz.
I think it's also Chaya Stoika,
Yes.
like an absolute heroine of
surviving three concentration
camps, and still having the strength, after years, to speak out and tell her stories through different ways, painting, singing, organizing, being part of different events. She says at some point, no, she's like, if I don't talk, if I don't tell this story, the whole thing repeats itself again. So you're talking about like resistance. No, it doesn't have to be fabulous, doesn't have to be like your typical out in the streets and screaming. Sometimes just also holding that space and talking about these very traumatic things. It's like I can't even imagine, it's like surviving such a traumatic experience, and then the strength that it takes to just go in front of people and talk about this. It's like it's massive. And I wanted also to mention, if I'm allowed, in the context of like women that resisted, there is a little known personality and survivor from Berlin, and that's Suleika Aldini. Does that name tell you something?
Not really. Could you tell us more?
Yes, I can tell you more. So Suleika Aldini was Romani, was German, so Sinti, and ended up in the concentration camp when she was like just 4 years old. Her family was murdered. However, she survived, and years after transitioned and became Suleika Aldini. I'm not going to give the dead name because it just doesn't make any. It's and became a snake whisperer and a flame swallower at some of the most famous places like bars and clubs here in Berlin. She was also really like a community gatherer years after. She didn't talk extensively on her experience as a survivor of the Holocaust because she was just a child, but she definitely built an archive of queer and trans life that wasn't just like, we're not talking about just white. She is part of the newly instated trans archives of the Schwules Museum. And when the Schwules Museum invited me for a talk, they were doing research on this, and they presented me with Suleika Aldini. I've never previously didn't know about Suleika, and I had the chance and the honor to go through like her pictures and her documents and materials, and I was in tears because it's one of the people that we don't really hear about, and we don't discuss it as much. But I think in general, as you also said, like women are not very, very seldom are invited to the table too.
And I believe that what you shared tell us exactly why it's so important to remember that being a woman under the Nazi regime shouldn't be just a footnote, because it totally shaped how you were targeted and also how you resisted and survived. And I believe that when doing research on this subject, women epistemologies, and especially Romani women epistemologies, queer women should be treated not as case studies or footnotes, but rather as producers of knowledge, because they lived and experienced all of that.
You mentioned Markowska and how her, her saving over, we're talking about over 50 or 100?
50 is the official number, but it was totally more.
We're talking about hundreds of kids, no? Her saving in the folds of her dress sometimes, and that is kindness. I remember reading something. She was like, I don't want any child to suffer through this. So she saved children, regardless whether they were like Roma, disabled, or, like maybe in the future we could lead also with the idea of kindness as resistance, as we become more and more detached of this like very human things like love, kindness.
I believe that this is extremely political, because this is just an example of how Romani women, when the state is absent or so violent with them, have created for such a long time these parallel systems of care and these networks of care, because that's exactly what it is. and this should be treated again not as a footnote, but or a
As a main
parenthesis, but
topic.
as a theory, because care networks, parallel care networks, as a political form of resistance are extremely important, and we even find them today.
Absolutely. I think I'm also like, as a child, I'm the result of, like the kindness of women and Romani women, and um, I think it's so important to underline that you don't need to have a degree, you don't need to get academic about resistance, about remembrance. That every single initiative, it's so needed.
Here, I would like to ask you, how do you see that we could transfer this knowledge, then how we could speak openly about those victims? Because the archive is already quite big, especially with the Jewish victims. We are trying our best to increase and make visible Roma victims at that case. But how? I mean, I'm asking how, but I already know the answer,
So
because
you tell us how. If you
Uh,
know the answer,
yeah, I would like to bring this topic and share my experience.
but let's
how
see
I
your
met
experience.
how I met Kat. Actually, it
Oh.
was
Okay.
5 or 6 years ago when I received a call, and he invited me to participate in the project. He asked me to record, to write a story.
I use they them pronouns or she.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Let's talk freely about this. It's like, I don't expect people to.
They asked me to record the story about,
A
to
letter.
write it first. Like, let's pretend that I'm that person who were in a concentration camp. I know some core details, like, for example, how old is this person? Do this person has a family? Who is the family, etc. And based on those facts, to create some small story and then to record it. And as far as I know, you made a performance after in the field where were a lot of speakers, and the important point that all those sound from the speakers were quite, how should I say, like, not loud, that force
Lower.
people to,
You could hear them in tandem.
yes,
in unison.
you could hear the a host, like, in general, but you couldn't hear properly what is from each speaker's goes, like what the speech the person is delivering. But once you go closer, which is also ask you to make some effort, right? When you go down, you're trying to pay your attention to what this person is trying to say, what's the story is about. It's a different already feelings in your body. You're kind of investing your energy to get this story, so you will remember that you made an effort. So I really like this project, and thank you for inviting me being part of it. But this is how I would like to open the discussion, how we can transfer this knowledge. Yes, how we can tell those stories about the victims.
Well, can I?
Yeah,
just
it's
give a
logically
bit,
that
just to give a bit more comment. First of all, thank you so much. It's really sweet that you mentioned this very important project. It's called Fields of Remembrance. We've actually just gone through a few titles, but this has been the final one. We've been working for a few years. It's a ongoing archive of voices of Romani activists, educators, artists that make a commitment. They take a Patenschaft, so they create a bridge with a specific person that was persecuted during the National Socialism. That means you don't become the person, but you are invited to write a letter to one specific person. We provide all the data that we have from the archives, which tends to be very summarized. We're talking about date of birth, name, date and place of extermination. Me and my collective, the Part Collective, which was born during our studies at the Mozarteum University, we did some research and we came across a lot of lists from Zwangsarbeitslager, so forced labor camps, with names. And we started in Salzburg, that had a forced labor camp in Max Glan. And then we started researching, of who are people and communities and voices, across Europe. And not only, we're also worked with Ethel Brooks, from the US. And that's how we also came across you. I think you were still a student at the Central European University, but also an actor. So we invited Petro to also write a letter to a specific person to create a bridge, a personal bridge, in an attempt to move away from the idea of like the victims, the Romani victims of the Nazi persecution are a number, like 500,000 or a million, you know, but individualized. We look, and I strongly believe in this, that remembrance should be personal and should be emotional. Like your letter was extremely beautiful and touching. And
you remember that?
Of course I remember it. You had
Even I don't remember.
I remember it, and you know, we can also, like, if you want it, we can bring it into this podcast at some point. I also
Let's
remember it
skip it.
because you are the only one who had a sound background, like a music background.
Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
yes. So you know, it was very free. You can also, Carmen Georgia also wrote a letter. You could choose the form in which you write this letter. Some people wanted to sing a song to the person. Some people imagined, because we're also talking children. We have Robert Gabris, who has also a very touching letter where they play a game with a young girl of like climbing into a tree, and it's really touching, and that's one of our attempt as a collective, but also personal, to humanize or rehumanize remembrance, and not just look at, you know, like granite structures, because they're not enough anymore. Like the fact that we have in the center of Berlin, by the Brandenburg, a memorial, of course it helps, and it, you know, it's like, but that's a first level of remembrance, and that's like, you know, tourists and people that see for the first time, like yourself, it's good to know that that it exists. But it's not enough if we actually believe that remembrance has a lot to do in the way we are being perceived, or the lack of remembrance in the way we are being persecuted nowadays. So to bring it closer, to just close your question, to bring it closer is humanizing, is creating, taking the responsibility as a young or not young Romani person, or taking the personal responsibility of carrying the memory of one individual or a group of individuals, and committing to it every single day. Like, you can never talk too little about the victims of the National Socialism.
Yeah. I mean, I found that those projects are important when you are trying to humanize, because in the time when extremists and far rights has a lot of space, public space, and their voices are heard, those...
We also need to take up the
Yes,
space and do it differently in a
exactly,
way. Like,
exactly. Yeah, that was my point.
yeah, that so this is a, you know, we do this, it's a sound installation, it's not a performance that is being installed at specific places of pain. So we always go around and we plant the sound in the soil, in places that used to be forced labor camps, as a way to also let the earth speak. You mentioned that you know, now all survivors are dead because of old age, and we don't have. So the last archival source that remains is the soil. The earth remembers. The soil never forgets people that walked there, people that suffered there, people that cried and bled on that very spot.
Yeah, you said it very beautiful. You just mentioned the memorial, and I don't know if you know it also, that it will be destroyed, because
in 2022 was a discussion with the Deutsche Bahn,
yes.
But as far as I know, the conflict was frozen.
Yeah.
There is nothing happen for now.
But also this thought about to destroy it.
Just
And this
erase
is
it.
not enough that we have this small memorial and just to build an S-Bahn line under the memorial to have the Deutsche Bahn one line more. This is also like you see the discrimination is going on. You see the oppression is going on, and no one is caring about also not the Bundestag and the politicians.
It just proves how easily
Yeah.
our pain can be just moved, because I think the idea was like we're gonna move it,
So
And-
there is, to be honest, let me contribute to this topic. There was a lack of information because it wasn't clear at the end. Do they want to move it, remove it, or they want just to use the space underground?
Underneath.
Because was also some negotiations between the Deutsche Bahn and the documentation center of Sinti and Roma, who was particularly involved into make this happen, this memorial. Yeah.
We are so used to be like told like, oh, we do this, but you get something else. No, we belong there. And the fact that you even dare to think that you might dig under us or something, for me that's absolutely not okay. It means that we're being taken as something that can be, just change, adapted according to the plans of the state or something. And let's not forget that Deutsche Bahn is the transport company that took people to the concentration camps.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So they do have a very big responsibility to handle these topics with a lot of care, which I don't think they have done, regardless of you promising me a room or a 10-story building. Honestly, it's a matter of respect.
At the same time, it's complex story with the lack of information, because from the other side, it could bring more visibility to the memorial. We are so happy that this memorial is placed where it is right now.
It has to be.
It has to be,
It's not
absolutely.
like-
me, but the memorial was not Selbstverständlichkeit. What is Selbstverständlichkeit in English?
To be taken by granted.
Yeah,
like
it-
Oh, yeah.
it was
It
supposed
was
to be
a
there.
fight, a fight that takes like years, and it built just
How long
2012.
did it take? How
like,
long
wha-
did it take for people to
Yes.
be acknowledged as Roma people to be acknowledged as victim of the Holocaust?
Yeah.
So I would like just to drive then the discussion, because this is our responsibilities, right?
I believe that even this story that you just told us about, it's a story of privilege. And I think that a lot of this burden to always talk about remembrance and resistance is put on our shoulders, because most of the people who are privileged and have very much access to this kind of information are not doing the work to educate themselves. So then the younger generation has to work so much and twice, because you also have to teach your community about what your ancestors have been through, but then also the privileged people who should do this work themselves and try to humanize this thing which is already humanized. Like how much humanizing can you do about some people who were killed by the Nazis?
I would like to contribute to your speech, because you miss one important point. I would start with educate yourself,
Yeah.
because this is the case for me. I educate myself about what happened. I had no ideas about the Roma Holocaust when I was even 20 years old. So and it starts. This is the first step, I believe. So this is the responsibilities from my perspective for the young generation. We should educate ourselves, and that's what missed in the previous generation. They don't have knowledge. They don't know what to transfer.
Those that can and have the possibility should educate themselves, but also consider becoming an educator, like something that you do and you go now towards. I want to become an educator because I have access to those privileges.
Actually, I had a very similar story to yours, because I'm also from Romania, and the Roma in Romania were actually slaves for 500 years, which I believe
No
it's
one knows about that.
the longest slavery in the world.
We do.
And I also found out about it when I was 20 years old. So imagine not knowing your history until you are 20. I think nobody except us, goes through this, which tore me apart, because I didn't learn about this at school. I learned it, from other activists, which again, it was their work to educate me. And it really changed my identity and shaped how I see the world and also how I see my community.
I also think that we have to create spaces where we feel comfortable to talk about these topics because they are so heavy and there is a lot of emotion and everyone has also another perspective. There are also people who has families who were persecuted, and it's you have to be careful what you say, that the people is not
hurt.
hard.
To come back to your question, like what do we have, what does our generation have to do, is like I think as we're talking about this, to refuse selective remembrance. First of all,
But look into the presence, because we talk about the different groups, but no one had just one identity. I believe that the word intersectionality, I mean, it's the fact. It comes much later, like in 80s, right?
With Kimberly Crenshaw.
I believe it's very important to talk about this because no one lives in just one category. I've never in my life been just one thing because I'm Roma, I'm a woman, I'm working class, I'm also a student, I'm a fighter. So I believe that it's something related to how we were made to think that we, have to break into manageable pieces and to be labeled just like those triangles. And I believe that this is totally fake because our truth lives in intersections. And I believe that also the system of oppressions doesn't come one at a time. No, they collide. And I believe that this is why it's so important today to talk about intersectionality, not just as a buzzword or something that is cool and trendy and everyone talks about, because this is a reality. And if we don't understand how these identities intersect, we will never be able to get the full picture of how violence and resistance actually happened.
Because violence always actions intersectional. And what came new with Kimberly Crenshaw is the idea of like understanding those intersections upon which we are being persecuted and naming them, and it's really important for me, mostly because we can manage to build communities of resistance easier, because I'm being persecuted for being this and this and this, and you're being persecuted for being this and this and that. But we also meet at an intersection and we form networks of resistance.
If you could leave one thought with the listeners about why we must remember all victim groups, what it would be?
I would say to them that fascism and what's happening right now, it's not a ghost, it's a neighbor, it's a politician, it's even a law that's been passing lately. And I believe that when we remember the Holocaust, we are not just mourning. I think we are also warning, because the same ideologies that killed our ancestors and are being replaced today as policy. And I believe that memory is not something passive, it's something that we use, and we use as a political tool, and it's our call to resist and talk about this. And I believe that and not to be silent as well, because history doesn't repeat itself, people do. So then I believe that it is our duty to talk about this and not be silent, because if you are silent, you are complicit. And when I think of the girls that I'm working with in the communities who are young and they organize themselves without funding and without protection, but just with loads of courage, I believe that we owe them a world in which the only option left is not just resistance. So I think it's very important to remember this and to use memory, not just a passive thing, but also as a political tool.
I also think that in this point we have to talk about solidarity, and not like a passive solidarity that you can post something on Instagram. No, it's active solidarity. We need that people come together to work together and to be in touch together, to create more rooms, to create more networks, to be conscious what's happened here, to hear also, to be like always to have your eyes open and not to look away when Unterdrückung,
oppression.
and when oppression happens. And this is something that it's too passive. We have really to take care. And I really hope that in some days we can remember all of the groups in more ways that it's understandable, and it's also accessible for everyone. And also the language what we use, it's so academic, and excuse me, but it's not our reality. I grew up in I don't know in what anything, but not in this. And it's so important to know what language we are using and how to combine this remembrance. And solidarity is my word.
Thank you.
Of course, I can
One
leave
thought.
one thought, you know. Two thoughts,
Deal.
please. Okay,
Deal.
good. Very short thoughts. Remembrance is resistance. And the second thought is none of us can be free until we all are free.
That's really short. Thank you so much.
You would like me to expand? I'm good with this. I think that's good. Și aducerea aminte este rezistență și nici una, nici unii, nici unix nu pot fi liber până nu suntem cu toții, toate, toțix libere.
We also need then the translation of what you just said.
I just said the same, but also in Romanian.
Okay.
Because you were talking about language, I think that's such a interesting topic as well.
Thank you for sharing your voices.
Thank you.
I believe that this podcast is not about just to remember. It's a part of creating an archive of resistance itself, as you said. If you find that meaningful, please subscribe and share our content. Join us for future commemoration and subscribe for our social medias. Together we remember, and together we resist.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.